2012. A few months ago, with Texas aflame from more than 8,000 wildfires brought on by extreme drought, a man who hopes to be the next president took pen in hand and went to work. Now therefore I, Rick Perry, Governor of Texas, under the authority vested in me by the Constitution of the State of Texas, do hereby proclaim the 3-day period from Friday, April 22nd, 2011 to Sunday, April 24th, 2011 as days of prayer for rain in the state of Texas. The governor prayed publicly and often. But alas, a rainless spring was followed by a rainless summer. July was the hottest month in recorded Texas history. Day after day, from Amarillo to Laredo, from Toadsuck to Twitty, folks were greeted by triple-digit temperatures and a slow death on the land. In the 4 months since Perry's request for divine intervention, his state has taken a dramatic turn for the worse. Nearly all of Texas is now in extreme or exceptional drought, the worst in Texas history. Lakes have disappeared, creeks are phantoms, their baked bottoms are littered with rotting dead fish. Farmers cannot coax a kernel of grain from the ground that looks like the skin of an old elephant. Is this Rick Perry's fault? A slap to a man who doesn't believe that humans can alter the Earth's climate? Is this God messing with Texas? Perry's tendency to use prayer as public policy demonstrates in the midst of a truly painful, wide-ranging, and catastrophic crisis how he would govern if he became president. Well, it's time for us just to hand it over to God and say, God, you're going to have to fix this. He said this in a speech in May, explaining how some of the nation's most serious problems could be solved. That was a warm-up of sorts for his prayer fest. Prayer fest of 30,000 evangelicals in Houston's Reliance Stadium on Saturday. From this gathering came a very specific prayer for economic recovery. On the following day, the first day that God could do anything about it, Wall Street suffered its worst one-day collapse since 2008. The Dow Jones sunk 635 points. Now, prayer can be meditative, it can be healing, it can be humbling. It can also be magical thinking. Given how Perry has said he would govern by outsourcing to the supernatural, it's worth asking if God is ignoring him. That's what the end of quote. That's what the reporter wrote. So that particular story emphasizes one approach to prayer. In fact, it's probably the most common approach to prayer, right? If we talk about prayer, to most people, they would say, what are we praying for? Who are we praying to? Interestingly enough, I remember hearing just a few weeks ago about I think it was an airline pilot that got fired, lost his job, because there was some problems with one of the plane's engines, and he asked the people in the airplane to pray with him, that they arrive safely. He was fired for that, because it was told that he frightened people by asking for prayer. You see, when everybody heard him ask for prayer, they thought they were going to crash, because why else would you pray if you weren't going to crash, right? You see? So that's kind of the way in our culture we typically consider prayer, you see. You know, we say, hey, he doesn't have a prayer. it means that he's so desperate that even prayer won't do any good. Prayer is reserved for kind of a 911 to the divine, is kind of the way it's seen, you say. So this is one particular type of prayer. Obviously, it's not the only kind of prayer, but it's a prayer that we are all familiar with, that most of us grew up with, and we all know very, very well. I'm going to talk today about 4 different types of prayer, 4 different categories of prayer. There's actually many types of prayer, actually more than 31, more than Baskin Robbins can boast in their ice cream flavors. But I'm going to talk about 4 general categories of prayer. And the first one is the one we've been talking about. It's when we pray to God. Typically, we're praying to God for something. I mean, if we didn't want something, we wouldn't be praying, is the logic behind that. And typically the prayer is one of imploring, beseeching, begging, promising, whatever it might be. So it's kind of like a phone call or email to the divine, saying, hey, can you take a few minutes and listen to me? If you remember Fiddler on the Roof, you see that play or the movie Fiddler on the Roof?
I don't know if you do.
Remember? Yeah, it's great. I've seen it a dozen times probably. Debbie, he had his lame horse, and he kept praying for the horse to be healed, and finally he says, God, he says, I know that you're busy with earthquakes and floods and hurricanes and volcano eruptions, all those things that you do. But can you take just about a minute and come down and heal my horse? Please? And it seemed like God never quite answered him, and he was very frustrated. But he never stopped asking, you see. And typically that's the way we ask, we pray in our culture is, God, let me get your attention. In fact, some people feel like God will hear them better if they pray loud. You see? So, maybe the divine, as old as he is, maybe he's a little hard of hearing. And I need to really belt it out there. So sometimes that's the approach that's taken. Sometimes it's believed if we pray long enough, God's going to hear us. God's going to get tired of us knocking at the door and say, okay, I'll stop what I'm doing and help you out here. I remember living in Evansville, Indiana, some few decades back, and I remember when I go into my church there, I drive past this Baptist church, I think it was, and the sign up there would say, the pastor is ill, please pray for the pastor. And then next week when I drove past, it says, pastor is very ill, please pray harder. And it says, pastor very, very ill, please pray very, very hard. And then there was nothing up there for several weeks. And it said, let's pray for a new pastor. The pastor didn't do so well, or at least by the standards that they wanted that to happen, you see. So typically we pray, we have something in mind that we want, and we ask, and we ask, and we ask again. With that kind of a prayer, basically we are in a position of being powerless, kind of like a little child begging a parent for something. We feel very separate from the divine. Prayer doesn't bring us any closer. And it doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes it does, but more often than not, it certainly didn't seem to. I remember when I was a kid growing up Catholic, most of the things I prayed for never happened. A few of them did, Most of them did not. I tried lighting some candles, and that helped a little bit sometimes.
Incense.
Incense, yeah, whatever, keep trying, keep on trying. You know, maybe if God doesn't hear me, at least he can smell, you know? So, and yet I'm not putting down those that pray that way, because this is their way of connecting with the divine. This is their way of dealing with needs in their life. And I think we've all been there one time or another, you know, when we get right down on our knees and we beg God, when we feel powerless and desperate. That's oftentimes what we revert to. And that's one type of prayer, praying to God. That's, again, the most common form in our culture. But there's another prayer, and the second type of prayer I call praying for God. The praying to God is typically from the mind. Praying for God is more a prayer of the heart. Praying for God is more of a devotional prayer or a contemplative prayer. It's actually praying for a deeper awareness of the divine, a deeper connection to the divine, a deeper relationship to the divine. This is the kind of prayer that we often find if we go to a monastery or a retreat, Catholic retreat center, or some Christian retreat. It's a devotional prayer. It's a prayer that is not looking for things, but is simply looking for a deeper experience and a deeper relationship with the divine. I remember listening to Godspell many years back, and that prayer of to know thee more, to love thee more, to serve thee more. You know, that's classic prayer from the heart, prayer of devotion, seeking an awareness of God. In that particular mindset, in the first type of prayer, the theological framework is that God is forever removed, infinitely far away. In this particular framework, God is outside of me, but union is possible. So oftentimes with this type of a prayer, it's a prayer of relationship. And God is seen as a friend or as a beloved. And so my heart yearns for my beloved, just as I would yearn for a lover. I yearn for the divine in a way that touches and fills my heart. Rumi's poetry, if you ever read Rumi, you hear Rumi a lot in the prayer for the beloved. It's beautiful. One of the potential problems of this type of prayer is that sometimes, even though it's a prayer for God, we're praying from the premise that we're still separate from God. So we're assuming that we're separate from God and we're praying for union. But oftentimes, once we start from that place of separateness, we get like the donkey with the stick and the carrot. You know, the faster we run toward the carrot, the faster it runs away. God can seem ever more elusive. Why is that? Because of our basic belief that God is not present here right now, that I need to open up more fully to bring God in. So devotional prayer is very beautiful, and at the same time, there are other forms of prayer. And I'm not implying any one of these is better than another. I want to be clear on that. The question is, what flavor works for me? What flavor works for you? What flavor is needed at this particular point in time? There are times when I may need to fall on my knees and pray to God. There are times when I need to sit and pray for God. And then the third type of prayer, and this is one that we're pretty familiar with in unity, this is praying with God. Praying with God, that's what I call it. In New Thought, in unity, it's often called scientific prayer. It's the prayer of co-creation, if you will. We enter into prayer as co-creators with the divine. So we enter into prayer not to find God, not to bring God closer, not to ask God for a favor, but to align our consciousness with the consciousness of the divine. To align our awareness with the divine awareness, with divine principles. And in that alignment, then, we are in the flow of the divine, and then we become co-creators in our life and in the world. So in this particular theological model, we are always one with God. We cannot be separate, but we can forget, you see. And that's where the apparent separation arises, out of our forgetfulness. There's no reality to that separation, but there's a forgetfulness. It's kind of like when we fall asleep. You know, we could be looking at a picture on the wall next to our bed. When we fall asleep, that picture doesn't necessarily disappear, but we're totally oblivious to it. And the moment we open our eyes and wake up, it's back there again, you see. So it's sort of that same way that prayer is a waking up process. Prayer is a remembering. It's a prayer, chanting, moving, singing. Prayer is often seen as a way of connecting, consciously connecting with the divine. So in this particular prayer, if we're praying for healing, typically what we do in the New Thought model, in the Unity model, is that we align ourselves with the divine mind. We remind ourselves, we remember that we are one with the divine. And then from that place, we affirm wholeness, we affirm healing, we visualize, we chant, or we speak the word, whatever modality works best for you, for wholeness, for healing. And then we let it go. We don't fixate on a particular outcome. We're not begging for something to happen. We're not even looking for anything specific to happen. We're simply knowing the truth that God is always present, that healing and perfect life is always present. Or abundance, or guidance, or whatever it is that we're looking for. So in this particular model, prayer isn't so much about getting something as it is about expanding our consciousness. And in fact, I would go so far as to say, I think sometimes the reason we may have what appear to be problems is that problem then gives us the motivation, the impetus to pray and thereby raise our consciousness. So if it wasn't for the problem, we wouldn't be praying. Then hopefully we get to the point where we don't need the problems for the prayer. But sometimes we do. Sometimes we don't really have the motivation to go deeply into the awareness of abundance, of abundant life, or of perfect health, or of perfect divine guidance, until there is a crisis or something needed in our life, and then we get the focus, and then life has got our attention. But again, it is possible to pray to affirm, not out of need or necessity or out of crisis, but simply to know this is the reality of who we are. And to recognize that as human beings, we are here to be co-creators with the divine. So we are not just creatures, we are co-creators. We are spiritual adults. We don't need to beg. We don't need to ask. We simply need to know. So, Harry Butterworth says that praying is like, he uses the metaphor of going to the bank, filling out a slip or a check or something, giving it to the teller. So when you go to the bank, presumably you don't get on your knees and beg for the money. You don't hopefully coerce anybody into giving you the money. You say, I have money in the bank that belongs to me. Here's my ticket. I want my money. In a matter-of-fact way. And so he says prayer can be very much the same way. Or flipping a light switch or turning on a faucet. The asking is not a begging, but the asking is simply the recognition that the flow is there, that the water is there waiting for us, the electricity is there waiting for us, the money is there waiting for us. So we wouldn't flip a light switch if we knew that there was no electricity, or we wouldn't turn on the water if we didn't know there was water in there. So we wouldn't ask if we didn't know that what we seek is already there. And again, what we seek is not so much stuff or things or particular circumstances, but a deeper realization of the divine, which is really what we all want. You know, the old saying that says God does not answer prayer, God is the answer to prayer. In other words, God isn't there to give us something. Something is there to make us aware of God. Because that's really why we're here. That's really why we're here. So that takes us into the fourth category, which is to pray as God. To pray as God. And this might be called mystical prayer. In the Christian terminology, it's called the prayer of quiet. In unity, we often refer to it as the silence with a capital S. It isn't just being quiet, but it's the deep silence. It's realizing in that timeless, wordless space of pure knowing our oneness. It's the experience some call presence, some call union, some simply call being. So it's the prayer that never ends. Jesus told his disciples to pray without ceasing. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm constantly reciting prayers? No. It means living in the knowing of our oneness with the divine, so that everything we do then becomes a prayer or is a prayer. We see ourselves, as one of my teachers says, we see ourselves as God's fingers, God's hands, God's toes, God's eyes, God's ears. We are here as instruments of the divine. We're not here just as creatures that God created because he was bored. We are here as the sense organs of the divine, if you will. Well, with every type of prayer, there's always potential problems. What could possibly be a problem with this kind of prayer? Well, sometimes it's so blissful and it's so ethereal that it makes it hard for folks to connect with the real world. And sometimes individuals that have had very powerful, transcendent spiritual experiences come back and have difficulty integrating into their everyday life. So praying as God doesn't mean that we necessarily have to sit in a cave somewhere, the Himalayas, but it does take, it takes skill to be able to be in the bank, in the grocery store, driving your car in a snowstorm. It takes presence, practice to be God and to drive the car at the same time. Okay? So here I am teaching God how to drive a car. This is God driving the car. This is quite literally what we're doing. We are here as the nerve fibers, as the instruments of the divine. So once again, the four types are praying to God, praying with God, praying for God, to God, for God, praying with God, and praying as God. So when you enter into your prayer time, it's really helpful to take a few minutes to just ask, where am I coming from? What assumptions am I making? Why am I praying? Am I praying for something? Am I praying to something? What is it that I want to do or to not do or to let go of or whatever it is? What's my intention? That's what's really important, is to be intentional. No one type of prayer is necessarily better than any other. What's important is you find what works for you. Find what is your particular flavor, your particular style of prayer. And that may change from day to day, from circumstance to circumstance. The most important thing, too, is to practice daily. Practice every day. That's really what's crucial. Doesn't matter so much how you pray as if you pray. You know, that's really what's important. It's so interesting in so many of these prayer studies where they have empirically, scientifically, experimentally looked at the efficacy of prayer, where people pray for plants, or they pray for animals, or they pray for something, and then they measure the effectiveness of that prayer. The interesting thing is, it doesn't matter who's praying or what kind of prayer you're praying. All that's necessary is people with a sincere heart and a willingness to pray. Pray. So that's what's important, is what works for me. What is my style? What is my flavor? So the next time you go into Baskin Robbins, think about your prayer life. And if, the next time you go to pray, think about Baskin Robbins. Say, which flavor